In the winter of 1935, Harlem did not sleep easily. The jazz still played. The neon still flickered above clubs on Lenox Avenue. Women in silk dresses still laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't quite funny. But beneath the music and perfume and polished shoes, there was something else, something tight in the air. Something that made men glance twice over their shoulders before stepping into alleys. The country was changing. And not kindly up from the south, whispers traveled faster. Then trains. Stories of white-robed men burning crosses in open fields. Stories of boys pulled from homes in the middle of the night. Stories that Harlem told itself could never happen here. This was New York. This was Harlem. This was different. Until it wasn't. The body was found just before dawn, not in the middle of the street. No. Whoever did it wanted to send a message, not create a spectacle. He was placed where he would be discovered by milk delivery boys and early risers. His face was bruised beyond recognition. His shirt torn. His pride stripped long before his strength. But it wasn't the injuries that chilled Harlem. It was what had been left beside him. A scrap of white cloth, not a robe. Not a hood. Just enough to make the meaning unmistakable. By noon, the neighborhood knew. By evening, the entire borough was whispering one name, Bumpy Johnson. The boy was his nephew. Not by paperwork, by blood, by responsibility, by promise. Bumpy Johnson did not rush to the scene. He did not shout in the street. He did not gather men or slam fists against tables. He arrived at the hospital alone, hat low, coat pressed, shoes polished as always. Composure was his armor. The doctors spoke carefully. Broken ribs, concussion, severe trauma. They did not know if the boy would wake. Bumpy nodded once. He stepped to the bedside. He did not touch the bruises. He did not curse. He simply stood there and studied the rise and fall of the boy's chest as though memorizing the rhythm. A lesser man might have exploded. A reckless man might have mobilized. But Bumpy Johnson understood something most men never learn. Violence is loud. Power is quiet. And Harlem was watching. That evening, word spread that Dutch Schultz had heard. Now Harlem. And Dutch Schultz had history, complicated, volatile history. Schultz was a golden age titan of New York's underworld. A man accustomed to command. A man whose name could silence rooms, but even Dutch knew this was not business, that this was something uglier. He sent word requesting a meeting. Bumpy accepted. They met in a back room of a neutral establishment, not a nightclub, not a warehouse, not territory claimed by either side. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a single hanging bulb that hummed faintly overhead. Dutch arrived first. He expected fury. He expected threats. Instead, Bumpy entered like a man attending church. Calm, measured, dignified. Dutch leaned back in his chair and studied him. "They're saying Southern boys," Dutch said quietly. "Klan sympathizers testing the water." Bumpy removed his gloves slowly before answering. "They want noise," he replied. Dutch narrowed his eyes. "You're not going to give it to them?" Bumpy met his gaze without blinking. "I don't intend to give them what they came for." The room settled into silence. Dutch understood strategy. He understood retaliation. He understood the politics of fear. But this was something else. "They hurt your blood," Dutch pressed. Bumpy folded his gloves neatly beside him. "Yes," he said softly. "And they expect me to prove their story right." Outside, Harlem simmered. Young men gathered in doorways. Anger pooled like gasoline waiting for a match. Mothers feared what nightfall might bring. Police patrols doubled, not to protect, but to contain. City officials were already drafting statements in anticipation of unrest. They expected Bumpy to strike. They expected chaos. They expected justification. Instead, Bumpy spent the next day walking. He visited pastors. Shop owners, widows who had buried sons in earlier, quieter injustices. He asked questions. He listened more than he spoke. And when men demanded retaliation, he gave them a single sentence: who benefits if Harlem burns? The question lingered. By the third day, newspapers began printing speculation. Gangland escalation feared. Northern racial tensions rising. They wanted spectacle. They wanted Harlem to fulfill the script. But something unexpected was happening. Harlem was waiting, because Bumpy was waiting. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Bumpy did not sit idle. He gathered information. Not rumors. Not rage. Facts. Witnesses who saw unfamiliar men lingering near the neighborhood days before the attack. License plates. Financial ties between local agitators and Southern organizations. Names that did not belong in Harlem. And then, quietly, he requested a meeting with a police captain whose political aspirations outweighed his prejudices. The captain hesitated before agreeing. Publicly, he could not be seen cooperating too closely. Privately, he was curious. They met in an office that smelled faintly of ink and stale coffee. Bumpy arrived alone. He placed a slim envelope on the desk. "I believe you're being tested," Bumpy said calmly. The captain frowned. "Tested how?" "To see whether this city tolerates imported hatred." The captain's jaw tightened. Bumpy continued, "You can let this disappear into paperwork. Or you can show the city what law looks like when it stands upright." There were no threats. No bribes. No raised voice. Just quiet expectation. The captain stared at the envelope for a long moment. "Why not handle it yourself?" he asked. Bumpy's answer came without hesitation. "Because Harlem deserves to see justice, not revenge." That sentence shifted something. The envelope was opened. Inside, evidence that could not easily be ignored. By the sixth day, arrests were made. Not scapegoats, not random men, but individuals whose affiliations linked them directly to organized racial intimidation efforts. The newspapers changed tone overnight. Police cracked down on extremist influence. Community cooperation prevents violence. The story they had hoped for, riots, retaliation, headlines soaked in chaos, never materialized. On the seventh day, the boy opened his eyes. Bumpy was there. The room was quiet. The bruises were still visible, but breath had steadied. Tears formed before words did. Bumpy leaned closer. "They tried to make a message out of you," he said gently. "Instead, you became a reason." The boy swallowed. "A reason for what?" "For Harlem to remember who it is." Outside the hospital, no fires burned. No windows shattered. Instead, candles lined sidewalks that night. Church bells rang. Shop lights stayed on. Police cruisers moved slower, aware they were being watched not with fear, but expectation. And Harlem stood taller, because one man refused to let rage write the ending. The city had waited for violence. What it received was dignity. And dignity, when held firmly enough, is heavier than fear. Harlem did not erupt. That was what frightened them most. City Hall had prepared for flames. The newspapers had prepared for blood. The police had prepared for mass arrests and headlines about contained unrest. But the week after the arrests, Harlem did something far more unsettling. It remained disciplined. Candles still flickered in church windows. The hospital curtains still shifted softly in winter drafts. The young men who had been ready to charge. The streets now stood guard over elders walking home after dark. There were no smashed storefronts, no retaliatory assaults, no wild speeches shouted from milk crates on corners. There was only quiet, and quiet, when expected to shatter, becomes power. But silence can also provoke desperation, because when hatred fails to provoke chaos, it searches for another way to win. 3 nights after Bumpy's nephew regained consciousness, Harlem's oldest independent bookstore went up in flames. The store had stood on 7th Avenue for decades. It carried poetry, political essays, sermons, and banned Southern literature that spoke openly about racial injustice. The owner, Mr. Carver, had survived 2 recessions and a robbery. But he had never seen his shop targeted. Until now. The fire was set after midnight. No one was inside, but the symbolism was unmistakable. This was not random. This was retaliation. The fire department arrived quickly, but the damage was done. Charred shelves collapsed inward. Pages blackened into fragile ghosts of words once spoken. Smoke clung to the block long after dawn, and once again, eyes turned toward Bumpy Johnson, because this was no longer an attack on one family. This was an attack on Harlem's mind. Bumpy arrived at the bookstore before sunrise. He did not speak to the reporters who had already begun gathering. He did not gesture. He did not posture. He stepped carefully over Ash, bent down, and lifted a half-burned book whose title could no longer be read. Mr. Carver stood nearby, trembling, not from cold, but from violation. They want us angry, Carver whispered. Bumpy studied the ruins. No, he replied quietly. They want us desperate. There was a difference. Desperation leads to mistakes, and mistakes were exactly what certain men were waiting for. That afternoon, rumors spread faster than the smoke had. They're regrouping. They're coming back. This is war. But Bumpy did not hold a rally. He did not issue threats. Instead, he requested another meeting. Not with the police. Not with politicians. With Dutch Schultz. The meeting this time was not in neutral territory. It was in Dutch's domain, an office above a busy warehouse, guarded by men who respected Schultz's authority. Dutch expected demands, expected perhaps a proposal for retaliation. Instead, Bumpy entered with the same composed gravity as before. You see it, Bumpy said calmly, looking out the window at the winter-gray skyline. They're trying to drag Harlem into the mud. Dutch lit a cigarette slowly. Then let's drag them first, he replied. But Bumpy did not sit. He did not raise his voice. He turned and faced Dutch fully. And give the city exactly what it's preparing for? Dutch exhaled smoke in a thin line. They burned a bookstore. And if Harlem burns in return, Bumpy said evenly, who does the headline blame? Dutch didn't answer because he knew the narrative would not read extremists attack Harlem. It would read Harlem erupts in violence, and those who hated them would smile. Dutch crushed the cigarette into an ashtray. You're playing a longer game, he muttered. Bumpy's eyes did not waver. I'm playing the right one. The next move stunned everyone. Instead of organizing retaliation, Bumpy announced something no one expected. A rebuilding fund. Not quietly. Publicly. Within 24 hours. Contributions began flowing in from jazz musicians, from church congregations, from shopkeepers, from even some white business owners who feared instability more than they feared integration. The message was subtle, but devastating. You cannot burn what refuses to crumble. But the forces behind the attacks were not finished. By midweek, something even more dangerous began circulating. Anonymous flyers. They were slipped under doors at night, pinned to lampposts, tucked into mail slots. The message was designed to provoke. They accused Bumpy of staging the attacks for sympathy, accused him of manipulating the arrests, accused him of exploiting Harlem's pain for influence. It was a calculated strike, not at his power, but at his integrity, because destroy a man's reputation, and you fracture the trust that holds a community together. The whispers began, not loud, not dominant. But present. Maybe he's playing politics. Maybe he wants control. It was the most insidious attack yet, and Bumpy heard it. He heard the doubt in voices that once carried certainty. He saw hesitation in eyes that once carried faith. And for the first time since the attack on his nephew, he allowed himself to sit alone in the quiet of his apartment. Long after midnight, he did not rage, but he did reflect, because leadership is not about commanding obedience. It is about maintaining trust. The following Sunday, Bumpy walked into church, not as a figure of power, but as a man among men. He did not sit in the back. He did not take the front row. He stood when invited. After the pastor paused mid-sermon and nodded toward him, there were no prepared remarks. No theatrics. No raised fists. He looked out over the congregation, at mothers, fathers, children, elders. "I cannot stop hatred from trying," he began softly. The room held its breath, "but I can refuse to become it." He let the words settle. "If you believe I would trade Harlem's dignity for influence, then you do not know me." There was no anger in his tone, only truth. "I will not answer cruelty with chaos. I will answer it with clarity. And if that costs me your confidence, I will carry that cost quietly." He stepped down. No applause. Just silence. Heavy. Processing. By Tuesday, something shifted. The anonymous flyers stopped appearing because they had failed. Trust, once tested and reinforced, becomes stronger than rumor. But the true turning point came unexpectedly, late Wednesday evening. The police captain who had previously met Bumpy requested a private conversation. He arrived without escort. Without press. Without ceremony. "There's something you should know," the captain said. Closing the door behind him, he explained that federal attention had begun circling. Not because of violence, but because of restraint. Reports had reached higher offices noting Harlem's refusal to erupt. And with that restraint came a realization among city officials. Bumpy Johnson was stabilizing Harlem more effectively than the police ever had. That frightened them, not because he was violent, but because he was respected. "There are discussions," the captain admitted carefully, "about undermining you." Bumpy listened without interruption. "They believe," the captain continued, "that your influence is becoming political." Bumpy almost smiled. "Dignity always becomes political when it refuses to bow," he said quietly. The captain leaned forward. "You could make this easier." "How?" "Distance yourself. Step back. Let things cool." Bumpy rose from his chair slowly. "I did not step forward for applause," he replied. "And I will not step back for comfort." The captain studied him. "Why?" Bumpy's answer was simple. "Because Harlem deserves to stand without asking permission." By the end of that week, the bookstore had been cleared of debris. A temporary storefront opened across the street. Donations exceeded expectations. And on reopening day, something extraordinary happened. Police officers stood outside, not to monitor, but to assist with crowd flow. No speeches were made. No banners waved. Mr. Carver cut a simple ribbon. And Bumpy stood at the edge of the crowd, hands folded behind his back. A young boy tugged at his coat sleeve. "Are they going to try again?" the boy asked quietly. Bumpy looked down at him. "Yes," he answered honestly. The boy swallowed. "Then how do we win?" Bumpy's gaze drifted across the street, to rebuilt shelves, to neighbors helping neighbors, to officers who now watched with different eyes. "We don't become what they expect," he said softly. And in that moment, Harlem understood something deeper than anger. Hatred feeds on reaction, but dignity starves it. The city had expected explosions. Instead, it faced composure. It had expected chaos. Instead, it saw discipline. It had expected violence. Instead, it encountered a man who refused to raise his voice, yet somehow forced the entire system to listen. And in the quiet that followed, the kind of quiet that makes powerful men uneasy, Harlem stood not as a battleground, but as a testament, not because it had struck back, but because it had risen above, and somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Those who had hoped to ignite a fire realized something chilling. They had lit a match, but they had awakened a leader. And leaders, when tested, do not burn. They endure. By the time winter loosened its grip on Harlem, something subtle had changed in the way people walked. Shoulders were no longer bent. Eyes no longer dropped first. Bookstore had reopened. The boy had healed enough to walk with a careful limp. The anonymous flyers had vanished like cowards in daylight. And yet, beneath the surface, the city was restless. Because systems built on quiet prejudice do not like public dignity, and dignity had begun to organize itself. Bumpy Johnson never called it a movement. He never used words that would invite headlines or surveillance. But shopkeepers had begun meeting regularly, not to discuss territory, but protection. Business owners agreed to pool small percentages of profits into a mutual support fund so that no one could be bankrupted by intimidation again. It was not loud. It was not illegal. It was simply discipline. And discipline unsettles those who rely on chaos. The first warning came in the form of an audit. City inspectors arrived unannounced at several Harlem establishments. In a single afternoon, health violations were cited. Permits were questioned. Licenses misplaced. Fines issued. Coincidence? Perhaps, until the pattern became clear. Every establishment connected, however loosely, to Bumpy's rebuilding fund was targeted. It was not an arrest. It was not an accusation. It was pressure. Pressure designed to isolate. Pressure designed to say, influence has a cost. That evening, a respected restaurant owner named Elijah knocked on Bumpy's door. Elijah was not a criminal. He was a chef who had fed half the neighborhood through lean winters and extended credit to families when paychecks ran short. They shut me down, Elijah said quietly. Said my refrigeration is outdated. Bumpy listened without interruption. They gave me 48 hours, Elijah continued. I can't afford new equipment that fast. There it was, not a threat. A squeeze. Bumpy placed his hat on the table. Who else? He asked calmly. By midnight, the list had grown. 5 businesses. All within walking distance. All connected by nothing more sinister than cooperation. The message was unmistakable. If you stand together, we will break you apart. The following morning, reporters began circling again. Anonymous city sources hinted that organized activity in Harlem was drawing scrutiny. The tone was careful but deliberate. They were building a case, not in court. In public. Perception. And perception can ruin a man faster than accusation. Dutch. There was less patience in his posture. They're coming for you, Dutch said bluntly. Not with guns. With paper. Bumpy poured 2 glasses of water before responding. They don't need guns, he said quietly. Paper ruins men more efficiently. Dutch leaned forward. You built leverage. Use it. Bumpy met his gaze steadily. If I fight this the way they expect, I confirm their suspicion. Dutch frowned. And if you don't? I expose it. Dutch studied him for a long moment. You're gambling. No, Bumpy replied softly. I'm choosing where to stand. That afternoon, something unprecedented happened. Bumpy requested a public meeting, not with city officials, but with business owners, pastors, and residents, not in secret. In the open. At a community hall with doors wide and press invited. The city assumed he would protest. They assumed he would accuse. They assumed he would inflame it. Instead, he walked onto the small wooden stage with no notes. He did not speak of racism. He did not speak of conspiracy. He spoke of standards. If the city requires new refrigeration, he began evenly, then we will meet that standard. The room shifted. If the city demands updated permits, we will update them. Reporters scribbled quickly. And if inspections are the price of doing business, then we will pass them. A murmur rippled through the crowd. He paused. But inspections must apply equally. There it was, not an attack, a principle. We will not protest regulation, he continued. We will request consistency. It was a masterstroke. By refusing to frame the situation as persecution, and instead framing it as fairness, he placed the burden back on the system. If Harlem passed every inspection, then what excuse remained? The next 48 hours became a spectacle. Of unity. Electricians volunteered services. Carpenters repaired infrastructure overnight. Community members pooled funds to purchase updated equipment for Elijah's restaurant. Young men who had once demanded retaliation now installed wiring and scrubbed floors. It was not glamorous. It was Not cinematic in the traditional sense, but it was powerful, because nothing disarms prejudice faster than undeniable competence. The inspectors returned, clipboards ready, expressions neutral. They found clean kitchens, updated wiring, proper documentation, one by one. Citations were lifted, not because of mercy, because there was no longer justification. The city had expected outrage. Instead, it encountered excellence. And excellence is difficult to criminalize, but those threatened by Bumpy's growing moral authority were not finished. If regulation failed, they would escalate. On a cold Thursday evening, as Bumpy left a small literary gathering at the rebuilt bookstore, two plainclothes officers approached. "Mr. Johnson," one said, tipping his hat slightly, "we need you to come with us." No warrant was presented, no explanation offered, just authority. Bumpy did not resist. He did not argue. He adjusted his coat and followed. Word traveled faster than the police car. By the time they reached the station, Harlem already knew. He was placed in an interrogation room, no charges filed, no paperwork processed. Just a desk. Two chairs, and silence designed to unsettle. An hour passed, then two. Finally, the police captain entered. He did not sit. "You're becoming inconvenient," the captain said evenly. Bumpy folded his hands on the table. Inconvenient to whom? To men who prefer Harlem fragmented. Bumpy's eyes did not flicker. "And you?" The captain hesitated. "I prefer order." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Then you prefer me free?" The captain studied him carefully. "You've avoided every trap." "Because I do not step where the floor is weak," Bumpy replied. There was no arrogance in his tone, only clarity. "You could leave the neighborhood," the captain suggested quietly. "Distance yourself and abandon it?" Bumpy asked softly. The captain did not answer, because he knew, without Bumpy's restraint, the anger simmering beneath, Harlem's surface might finally boil, and that would justify everything. The captain stepped back. "You're free to go." No charges. No explanation. Just release. Outside the station, Harlem had gathered, not with torches, not with weapons, but with presence. Mothers. Fathers. Clergy. Shopkeepers. Dutch stood at the edge of the crowd, silent but watchful, when Bumpy emerged. There was no cheering, only stillness. He paused at the top of the steps and looked out at them. "They hoped you would react," he said calmly. "You did not." His nephew stepped forward from the crowd, walking stronger now. "They hoped you would fear," Bumpy continued. "You did not." He descended the steps slowly. "They hoped I would break." He stopped. "But I do not bend. For intimidation." The silence that followed was not empty. It was solid. Immovable. In that moment, the system realized something dangerous. It could not paint him reckless. It could not paint him violent. It could not paint him criminal. At least, not convincingly, because every move he made reinforced discipline, and discipline, when consistent, becomes legitimacy. That night, Harlem did not celebrate. It did not riot. It did not chant. It simply walked home heads high, because the city had tried to erase him quietly, and he had answered without shouting. The bookstore lights glowed warmly against the night. Elijah's restaurant reopened, fully booked. Inspectors no longer lingered unnecessarily. And somewhere in offices far from Lenox Avenue, men who preferred control over cooperation began recalculating, because they had misjudged him. They believed restraint was weakness. They mistook composure for vulnerability. They underestimated the power of a man who understood that true authority is not proven through force, but through refusal. And Harlem understood something deeper now. They were not being saved. They were being steadied. Bumpy Johnson did not fight for dominance. He fought for dignity. And dignity, when defended without violence, unsettles even the most powerful institutions. System had attempted to erase him. Instead, it had elevated him. But power rarely retreats quietly. It waits. And somewhere beyond the neighborhood's watchful streets, a larger storm was forming, because when intimidation fails, those who rely on it grow desperate. Spring arrived cautiously in Harlem, as if unsure whether it was welcome. The air softened. The trees along 7th Avenue showed hesitant buds. But beneath that gentle shift in season, intimidation had failed. The quiet detention had failed. Bumpy Johnson had not raised his voice. He had not organized retaliation. He had not allowed Harlem to fracture, and that was precisely the problem. A man who commands through fear can be discredited. A man who commands through violence can be arrested. But a man who commands through dignity, he becomes difficult to dismantle. So the strategy evolved. The city would not strike him from outside. It would attempt to divide him from within. The first fracture came disguised as opportunity. A delegation from downtown arrived one afternoon. With polished shoes and polite smiles, they requested a private discussion about economic collaboration. They spoke of investment, redevelopment, and modernization. They spoke of Harlem's untapped potential. The language was smooth. Intent was sharper. They proposed relocating certain businesses to make room for improvement projects. They proposed new management oversight. They proposed funding substantial funding contingent upon leadership restructuring. In simpler terms, step aside. Let the city manage Harlem. Bumpy listened without interrupting. He did not bristle. He did not object prematurely. He allowed them to finish outlining their proposal, every calculated detail of it. When they were done, the lead delegate leaned forward confidently. This would stabilize things, the man said. Remove unnecessary tensions. Bumpy folded his hands gently atop the table. Stability without respect, he replied quietly, is submission. The delegate's smile thinned. We're offering resources. You're offering control, Bumpy corrected calmly. A brief. Bumpy's gaze remained steady. Influence must be earned, he answered, not absorbed. The meeting ended without agreement, but the attempt was clear. If he could not be pressured into violence, perhaps he could be tempted into compliance. He returned to Harlem that evening with no announcement, no declaration. He walked through the neighborhood as he always did, unhurried, laughter drifting out through open windows. He saw Mr. Carver restocking shelves with deliberate pride. This was not a territory to be managed. It was a community to be respected. But tension escalated again that same week. A prominent city newspaper published a feature piece questioning informal power structures within Harlem. It did not accuse Bumpy of crimes. It did not use inflammatory language. It did something more strategic. It cast doubt that suggested that Harlem's recent calm was the product of unofficial influence. It implied that order maintained outside direct municipal oversight was inherently unstable. The message was subtle but clear. No community should function without the city's guiding hand, and Bumpy's name appeared, carefully positioned within speculation. It was the most refined attack yet, not forced. Narrative. That evening, Dutch Schultz visited him without sending word ahead. Dutch was not smiling. They're reshaping perception. Dutch said bluntly. That article? It's the opening act. Bumpy nodded slowly. Yes. They'll push until you're either absorbed or isolated. Bumpy poured 2 cups of coffee before answering. Then we make isolation impossible. Dutch studied him carefully. How? Bumpy looked toward the window, where twilight wrapped Harlem in a muted glow. We make the city see what Harlem already knows. And so, instead of retreating or confronting the newspaper directly, police leadership to reporters, to attend a community forum, not to debate, not to protest, but to observe. The event would showcase Harlem's businesses, schools, and civic organizations. It would highlight compliance with every regulation recently imposed. And cooperation. It was not defiance. It was demonstration. When the evening arrived, The community hall was transformed. Tables lined the walls displaying permits, inspection certificates, renovation receipts. Photographs showed volunteers rebuilding storefronts. Children from local schools recited poetry about resilience and unity. Reporters moved through the room, pens ready. City officials stood stiffly at first. They had expected speeches. They had expected accusations. Instead, they found structure. Order. Self. Governance. Bumpy waited until the end to speak. He did not take center stage. He stood among the business owners. For months, he began evenly. There has been concern about stability. His voice carried without force. What you see tonight is not resistance. It is responsibility. He gestured subtly toward Elijah, toward Mr. Carver, toward mothers who balanced ledgers as carefully as any banker downtown. Harlem does not reject oversight, he continued. We reject neglect. The distinction landed heavily. We have met every standard asked of us. We have passed every inspection. We have complied with every ordinance. A pause, but we ask for consistency. The word echoed. Consistency. Not privilege. Not exception. Equality. A reporter raised a hand. Mr. Johnson, are you positioning yourself as a political leader? Bumpy's answer was immediate. No. A ripple of surprise. I am positioning myself as a neighbor. The room absorbed it. And if leadership grows from responsibility, he added quietly, that is the community's decision, not mine. There was no applause. Just reflection. But something subtle shifted. The narrative had been challenged, not with confrontation, but with transparency. In the days that followed, a second article appeared, this one different in tone. It highlighted Harlem's rapid compliance with city standards. It praised community cooperation. It acknowledged the rebuilding efforts. It did not crown Bumpy, but it no longer questioned him, and that was enough. Yet the most powerful moment came unexpectedly. Late one afternoon, the police captain who had once detained Bumpy arrived at Elijah's restaurant, not in uniform, not on duty. He approached Bumpy quietly. I misjudged you, the captain admitted. Bumpy regarded him calmly. You misjudged Harlem. He corrected gently. The captain nodded. Yes. There was no handshake for cameras. No ceremony, just acknowledgement. You could have made this city justify every fear it had. The captain continued. You didn't. Bumpy's voice was steady. Fear justifies itself without help. The captain looked around at the full restaurant, at diverse faces seated together, at the absence of unrest. I see it now, he said quietly, and that was the day the city finally understood. Not through defeat, not through surrender, but through endurance. They understood that Harlem was not volatile. It was vigilant. They understood that Bumpy Johnson was not destabilizing. He was anchoring. They understood that dignity, when defended patiently, exposes prejudice without shouting its name. That evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, Bumpy walked alone down Lenox Avenue. He paused outside the bookstore. Inside, his nephew stood at the counter, helping a young girl choose a novel. The boy looked up and caught his uncle's eye. There was no fear there now, only strength. Bumpy gave a small nod. Not of victory. Of completion. Because this battle had never been about dominance. It had been about direction. Hatred had tried to provoke. The system had tried to pressure. The press had tried to question. And through it all, Bumpy Johnson had remained what he always was. Composed. Measured. Unmoved by bait. He had not answered cruelty with cruelty. He had not answered intimidation with rage. He had answered every attempt to diminish Harlem with one unwavering principle. Dignity is not negotiable. And in the quiet that followed, Harlem stood taller, not because someone had fought for it loudly, but because someone had refused to let it fall quietly. The city finally understood you cannot erase a man who refuses to step out of his own integrity. You cannot destabilize a community that chooses discipline over reaction, and you cannot provoke chaos from those who have decided to become unshakable. Spring deepened. Windows opened wider. Music returned to the streets, not forced, not defiant, just alive. And somewhere beyond Harlem, those who once plotted disruption moved their attention elsewhere, because the lesson had been learned. Harlem did not burn. It endured. And Bumpy Johnson, walking home beneath a softening sky, carried no banner, no title, no declaration, only the quiet knowledge that sometimes the most powerful act is restraint, and sometimes the loudest victory is silence.